and to provide some feedback and key things from the hui, but also where to from here. So we're structuring this session very much as a kind of a follow-up, and so with all this richness that we've had over the past few days, so what do we do with that kind of wealth of knowledge and energy? Where do we take that? So I'm going to invite first Lila to come and give some feedback on these sticky notes that we put up on the window earlier on. Lila.
Thanks for those of you who played the sticky note game. And although it was several hours ago now that you were reflecting on the day before, I think a lot of the themes that you identified have really been reinforced by the panels this afternoon. So in terms of I mean, I've just tried to capture what you said in some kind of summary version, or giving it a little bit of coherence across the themes, but you know, there were some very unique contributions, so thank you for those too. So first of all, on the alternative values and objectives that would inform our alternative and progressive trade policy, there was a strong emphasis on rights as an underpinning sort of value, human rights, labour rights, the right to development, the right to health, I guess in a sense the right to a flourishing community and to flourish within the community. There was a very strong emphasis in your idea, you know, your values and objectives that I would summarise as place-based concerns. So a really deep sort of rooting of values in place, and a sense that the existing environment doesn't know about our place or places, doesn't care about our place, doesn't have a connection to our place. And so that came through both in terms of a sort of kaupapa or treaty-based approach, but also more broadly the sense that, you know, our values must be about how we live in a particular space together, and that seemed to be more or less geographically defined or connected to the land. Strong emphasis on self-reliance and self-determination and tino rangatiratanga in the broadest sense. So, and I think there was a real connection to the place-based concerns with that. And the putting the market in its place. So, you know, all of this is a framework that we are dealing with now is market enabling, whereas there was a strong sense from your values and objectives that it's about governing the market and putting the market in its appropriate place instead of as the dominant feature of our policy, and justice and equality values and objectives. I think that sort of captures the strongest value statements and objective statements that were made. The second area was alternative trade forms and alternatives to trade. And I thought actually that last panel really had quite a lot to say about this, even though it wasn't its direct topic. And one of the words that Jesse Chalmers used, which wasn't really used in the post-its, but I think it actually captures a lot of what they were saying, was this idea about resilience. And that, you know, when we stand back and look at the system we've created, it's a system that actually erodes our resilience and erodes our capacity for innovation by either having a lot of good stuff extracted from us, as, you know, allowing that to happen, including our people and our skills, or relying on importing the product of other people's innovation, whether it's Netflix or drugs, you know. So I think that underlying that whole list you had up there on alternative trade forms and alternatives to trade is the importance of our domestic or local systems being enabling our local innovation and resilience, and that sort of cut across a whole lot of things. So there were various sort of ideas that came up in that area, a lot around democratic structures at the community and national level, the way that land is viewed and the legal status of land, the opportunities for local investment, and the super fund was specifically mentioned there. A range of ideas around sharing, cooperation, public-public partnerships, so becoming less reliant on the consumer-corporate relationship and the state as the mediator of that, actually being turning that on its head and doing our own things. And Indigenous trade and industry policy, both of which was seen as an alternative trade form or an alternative to trade. But again, a really strong sense of being in our places and encouraging the local, which I thought was interesting, whether it's in currencies or the UBI or other policies that were suggested, and there are a whole bunch there. And finally, a few people did put up some thoughts on the actual agreements. The strongest sort of theme of those was around the process by which agreements are developed. So the importance of including civil society, of openly developing agreements and of subjecting agreements to public interest tests, and having sunset provisions, review provisions, limiting trade agreements to agreements on tariffs, so like the sort of more traditional commodity kind of trade type agreements, not using the same agreements to do all the other stuff that we heard about is done in those agreements, and really clearly making the agreement subject to the values that have been articulated already. So I hope that kind of captures your post-its, but if it doesn't, you'll get a chance to have a say now anyway.
Thanks very much for doing that, Lila. That's great. We, at the beginning, heard from Jane Kelsey in her opening talk around some of the issues underpinning this hui. One of the things that we thought might be useful is if Jane just gives us a snapshot of some of the other things that are happening in the international space around trade alternatives, where things are at, and what are some international examples of processes and outcomes that we should be aware of as we move into the thinking about where next. So, Jane, over to you.
For those who can access the daily blog website, you'll see that the second half of what I was going to say yesterday is actually about things that are already going on or being discussed. And the reason why we thought it would be a good thing to do that is we are often told, well, firstly, we're told that we don't have any alternatives and that we're just anti-everything. But when we do have alternatives, we're told that they're not realistic and there's no way of achieving them. And so I just wanted to highlight a number of the developments that are happening internationally that show that these things are not unique, these discussions are not unique to here, and that there are real moves occurring internationally. While people talk about the World Trade Organization, there is another entity called UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And it gets poo-pooed because it actually does old stuff, that is, it does kind of real development stuff and focuses on trade and things. And they put out just last month a new report, the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report for 2018. And I've got a number of quotes from that in the paper, which are quite stunning. But if I can, I just want to give you one quote. The tragedy of our times is that just as bolder international cooperation is needed to address the causes of failure in the system, more than 3 decades of relentless banging of the free trade drum has drowned out the sense of trust, fairness and justice on which cooperation depends. Now this is UNCTAD saying that. And so, yeah. This is not left field radical thinking. But one of the points that people have made, and Lila stressed again, is taking the trade stuff back to its knitting, back to dealing with real issues of trade. And the UNCTAD 2018 report calls on UN member states to revisit the Havana Charter that led to the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and to update it for the digital age. And they point out that the Havana Charter recognised links between labour market conditions, inequality and trade, anti-competitive business practices, monopolistic control and limited access to the market. And so they say, what we need to do is to get rid of all the ephemera that has come into the trade arena in the last 30 years and try to recover the balancing that was integral to the Havana Charter in the early stages. So that is an interesting discussion that is happening in the international arena, being led especially by developing countries, but also a New Zealand economist who is one of the chief economists at that division of UNCTAD. We've also heard from people about the UN Human Rights Council initiative of the binding instrument on transnational corporations and human rights. And that meeting is happening this week in Geneva. And there is a big backlash. The US has boycotted it, the EU is trying to white-ant it, and the New Zealand government has been silent. So it's an area, it's something that's happening, and it's an area in which we can push for the New Zealand government to take a progressive position. The UN Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples, Sanya mentioned a number of the UN Rapporteurs. One of the things the UN Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples did was hold a series of workshops internationally on investor-state dispute settlement in different regions. So there was one in Peru and one in Bangkok at which Māori were present. And there is the real potential, if the new Minister for Crown Māori relations is actually going to take his mandate of resetting Crown Māori relations on hard issues and finding opportunities for active partnerships between Crown and Māori. He could in fact engage with the UN Rapporteur on how, along with others, to give life to this process, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there is a mechanism there that can connect that international to the local. There are many initiatives that are happening internationally now to deal with the democratic deficit, to enable citizens to hold governments to account. And we've heard a number of those mentioned today, including obligations to disclose and debate mandates, to bring the elected politicians into the process, to conduct cost-benefit impact analyses, whether it's on specific issues. The head of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, called for health impact assessments on all these agreements. Again, not just our local doctors for healthy trade. This is a call that's happening internationally. But there are also, in a number of countries, requirements for referenda for the adoption of agreements. And there are processes requiring supermajorities if legislatures are planning to adopt such legislation, but also, as was mentioned in the last panel, sunset provisions. That these are finite periods of time, and that you have to go through the processes again if you are going to renew them. Now, these are all things about adopting new positions, but we have a legacy problem. We have this batch of things already. And if Fran O'Sullivan has her way from this morning, we will be rushing to finalise the ratification of the latest tppa2018. And I must say the economic arguments she uses, she should know better. But that's what propaganda is. But part of the legacy problem that we're discussing in international forums is how we terminate existing agreements. And there are legal answers and there are political answers. Yeah? Standalone investment agreements are being terminated. Yeah? A number of countries are terminating them, and even Trump now has added to that between Canada and the US and winding it back with Mexico. But we've talked about countries also developing alternative models, South Africa and India and Brazil. And a decade ago, this kind of talk about withdrawing from agreements would have been incendiary. And now it's actually what next week I'll be discussing again at the UNCTAD World Investment Forum, where we have an International Commission of Jurists panel convened specifically to discuss this with a number of governments and myself and the European Union guy promoting a multilateral investment court. But there is an additional interesting idea that we are working on with some other governments, and that is for a number of governments to sign a multilateral agreement, that is a multi-party agreement, to say that they are agreeing to terminate the whole or part of agreements between themselves. Yeah? Because it's very hard for individual countries, even if they can do it legally, politically, to say we're going to withdraw from this agreement or that agreement. But if there is a critical mass of countries who are signing up to such an agreement, then there is a momentum and cover, and especially if some of those are more larger states. And there is a precedent for that in what is happening in some of the international taxation treaties at present, as well as what is happening with the European Union cancelling its internal bilateral investment treaties. So I just wanted to give you a sense, if people say to you, oh yeah, okay, you spent 2 days having a nice talk shop, but it's totally unrealistic, that's actually not the reality of what is happening in the international debates. And so we need to push our government, as we're having the discussions here about alternatives, to actually positively engage in this. And even though they have a policy of no ISDS in future agreements, they are not even in the public domain internationally owning and pushing that position. Yeah? So we need to get them to play a responsible, progressive leadership role. Now, the last thing I want to say is that as part of doing that, and especially because the Trade for All process and its committee is due to work, we don't know, they keep extending the deadline probably until May next year. I want to establish 4 working groups that will be intensive working groups. 1 on investment, 2 on climate change, 3 on the digital, and the 4th, which is already in train, partly at the Waitangi Tribunal and at a hui planned for next month, is Māori and Tangata Whenua and Treaty. Now, there may be others who also want to do that, but I want this to be a real ginger group pressure point on the government on those issues in the Trade for All process and more broadly in the negotiations. I have a number of people who offered to be part of the discussions who then weren't able to but are interested in that. If you are interested in and it will involve some real work, let me know, but we will also then develop a broader kind of discussion group for those who are interested but don't feel confident enough or don't have enough time to actually participate in the working groups. So just a final thank you from me to you all, to our facilitators, our panellists, and to Val. And Val's mum, who's for looking after the tea and coffee, which was invaluable. Thank you. And to Aaron for keeping the live feed going. And now over to Barry.
Okay, we can't let Jane get away with that. Can we give Jane a huge round of applause for everything she's done to bring us together? So what we're going to do is in about 15 minutes, we'll show the film that we were going to show at the beginning, which is Jim Stanford talking about alternatives. But we wanted, before people leave, to just have a chance to check in with each other. And I wanted to suggest that we do this in groups of people who you haven't met. So form groups, maybe 3 people. This is your chance to touch in with people you've seen across the room, but haven't had a chance to talk to. And we'll do this for 10 minutes. And the key things that we want to do is just give us a couple of things that you found really noteworthy and stuff that you wanted to kind of say, okay, from the hui, these things really stood out. And the second thing is what you think that follow-up would look like, including whether or not you want to be part of the 4 working groups that Jane outlined. Or, as Jane said, if you have suggestions for other working groups. So can we do that? Yeah.
Remembering we've got people out there. So the question was, what's the scope of the investment group? It's basically taking the position that the government has staked out and taking it through to being a leading position of vocal support for the end of ISDS in the range of international forums and delivering that here, including putting the pressure on for the legislation to have no ISDS in future agreements, which New Zealand First's Fletcher Tabuto promoted as a member, and Winston, of course, supported, and which the Australian Labor Party has now said that they will promote. So it's that kind of activity.
So great. And so, in your groups, you may, when you're discussing kind of stuff that we ought to do to follow up, maybe that's a great example. We need primary legislation that says no ISDS, proper processes on trade agreement, proper parliamentary scrutiny, proper assessment. Maybe that's the follow-up. So if we can do this, 10 minutes to get some closure, talk to some people you haven't talked to, do it with some energy, come back, we'll do a quick kind of shout-out follow-up, and then we'll watch the film. Sound okay? And those of you online, please feel free to put stuff through to Alt Trade. It would be great to hear from you. Just a couple of minutes more. Is everyone ready? Let's do it, okay? So again, we'll just have a quick kind of communication with each other around what you found significant and things for follow-up. I'll just grab some note paper. So who wants to kick off? Maybe somebody over here?
Sorry, I didn't know I needed it, but we were talking about people needing to feel that they can actually do something because of that agenda that's been telling us that there's no alternative, and then taking the next step of actually start doing something about, you know, not just talking about the problems, but then actually doing something about the problems, and seeing that as sort of a starting point, if you like.
Cool. Great. Really good, that sense of empowerment that actually, and I think Jane's talk was really interesting on that, to tell us of the stuff going on internationally that gives us a kind of a reference point.
Well, for the last 30 years we've been told there's no alternative, and
Yeah.
exactly, and we've got to say, well, actually that's a load of rubbish.
Cool. Okay. There are many alternatives. Louise.
I had the good fortune to talk to a couple of Australian colleagues, and although this thought didn't arise in that conversation, it did occur to me that as part of a multi-strand, etc., way of trying to get our way to what is a better trade agenda, if we want one, is whether or not there are some ideas that a partnership with Australia is one, not a very formal thing, but whether there are ways Australia and New Zealand can form some common ideas.
Okay, good. Who's next? Who'd like to...
Oh, well. Just the same point, that was the first point, that as societies and as polities and governments were enthralled to large corporations, but by re-transferring the power to do things into communities, the corporations in that domain become irrelevant, and that was kind of a reason to believe in the idea of re-establishing our economy at the community level.
Okay, great. And I guess building on the grassroots alternatives, some of the stuff that has been talked about across a number of panels. Great. Cool. Over here, yeah.
Kia ora. Our group talked about really how we could build the movement in a whole range of ways to strengthen ourselves so that we could go out and help build the movement, but also the impact of protests, whether it be protests on the streets, within our organisations, and extending the knowledge that we've obtained today and in the future to our communities and to the wider public, so that there'll be action taken over these issues.
Cool.
Any more?
We discussed it a little bit, but what I wanted to bring up, which we really haven't covered today, which is, I think of it as the elephant in the room, and that's money. And all of this, of course, is driven by money and the need for money. And we're prepared to, degrade the environment for money, and it's just money. And I think that as a group and as a nation and as a people, we need to start taking money out of the equation, which has been great because that's taking money out of the equation has come up. But being a social creditor, our belief basically is that money is the least of our worries, because actually it's the government's job to make its own money. And what we've done in this country, and this is where we've ended up today with our free trade agreements, is that because we've stopped making, we only make 3% of our currency, the rest we're borrowing from the international private banking sector, and because of that we're prepared to degrade our environment to try and pay that back. And so I think it's really important to start talking about the money side of this equation, because that's how we're going to create enough collateral, if you like, to stop degrading the environment and do all the good things that we really want to do. So the other elephant is our political parties have so let us down, and so we need to start looking about how we deal with this as a political group, as a lobby group, a political group that has power. Okay, thank you. I give up.
I'll make it real quick. The feeling in our group is that this gives us hope. The fact that people from various backgrounds, political parties, organisations, even countries, can get together and start discussing this in an open forum, open in front of each other and also on the internet. And I think discussing with our peers is the first thing. It's the foundation for further decisions, and that gives me hope, and I think it gives everyone hope, and I think we need hope because that fires us up for change.
Cool. Thank you.
Can I just add? I thought that what was really empowering and really positive that came out of this meeting was when we learned today that we can reverse, if you like, or get out of investment agreements. This, I think Jane said, might have been unthinkable, or was unthinkable years ago, but, thank you, Donald Trump, for doing it. And yeah, it's fantastic to think that actually one can break these binding agreements, and that's the most positive thing I've heard in a long time.
Cool.
I guess my reflection on the 2 days is the answer to there is no alternative is that the status quo is always there, and just saying no can be a perfectly adequate answer. And while it's nice to think about, gee, what could the alternative be, and to try to build the alternative, you're right to just say no is where you can start from, and you can stand secure.
Okay. So did you have something to add?
Well, I like what Jeff said, but no, our group, we talked about a lot of different things, but the consultation process and the importance of making that meaningful and the timing of it was an insight that stood out for us.
Cool. Michael?
The conversation we had was around the sense that for a long time we've been fighting these things. So the commentary about how long we've been fighting for real action on climate change, and yet some things are just not changing fast enough. And our expectations are unmet by some of the progressive parties upon which we place our trust. And it makes me think that, you know, when we should be bold in stating our alternatives, because when we are bold, it starts to demonstrate the inconsistencies with the existing status quo. So, you know, our claim should be for a clean world. Our claim should be for free education, for free healthcare, because when we make those demands, which are reasonable demands, then it exposes all of the fallacies of the free trade agreements. We know what the solutions are, we just need to be bold enough to state them.
Yep. Peter, could you? Yep.
Thank you. I just, as someone might have heard it, I just mentioned this one is a responsible family planning in certain countries, because I did find I have friends, Indian friends, told me we can beat you in population, beat China in population in some years' time, and I was like shocked. But this is not an area you should get competitive about. But anyway, this is a planner with limited resources, and I think we have to redefine what's the so-called development and put a ban on certain things. I actually believe environment even above, say, people above profits, and environment should be even above people, because we don't own this planet. I mean, we should keep it, we should make it better for future generations, as well as other species. Animals and plants keep disappearing. And I found it's, as we have to learn to put a ban on certain, most development if it's damaging to the environment, and live within our means. I personally need to learn a lot in this way, in this area. And yeah, basically just I have heaps of things, but that's mainly 2 points I make. And another thing is, this is a wonderful platform and forum. I feel we can get, I hope someone can work with me. We can get all those foreign students from all different countries in New Zealand already, and come to learn from this and to know the pros and cons of, and not, instead of repeating the mistake some developed country has made, and they have to develop their own way. When they go back to their country, they are the leader to their future government or future civil society. And I think they can learn a lot from things, from opportunity like this, and just how do we get them together. Yeah, that's all.
Great, thank you. I think we'll leave it there, unless anyone's got anything more burning to say. This has, I think, been a really great hui. You know, I don't know about you all, but I've certainly had times over the past couple of days where I've just kind of thought, yeah, actually I'd forgotten about that, or I'd just forgotten about the importance of it, or how these issues connected. I think we've, you know, once again, thanks to Jane, but also, you know, to all of the panelists, all of the facilitators, the kind of all of you all who have stayed with the process, of people online. And you know, the appeal to you is to kind of stay involved, because, you know, this whole thing about there is no alternatives, you know, if there's one thing to take away from this, it's the fact that we are living in an era of two really important things. One is that everything is up for grabs. You know, the old certainties of there is no alternative are really up for grabs at the moment. And, you know, that even applies to stuff in New Zealand and New Zealand trade policy. And, you know, I was saying to I've been calling for trade alternatives for the past 30 years. And suddenly the New Zealand government's saying, oh, we're going to have a process to consider trade alternatives. Now, we may be deeply cynical about that process and think that it's not set up with the right parameters and so on. But I think we all need to take ownership of that process and say, okay, yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. Let's tell you what these alternatives are. And I think that we need a kind of sense of self-confidence and empowerment, because it was the kind of civil society protests. It was the people who didn't like the TPPA. It was all the sense that trade policy is really out of touch with what we need for the future that brought them to the point of saying that we need a process like this. So we've got to use it. We've got the space. We've got to use it in order to put our stuff right in the centre. And Jane's suggestion of following up with the working groups and the discussion group to follow up, please do get involved and do continue. I know many of you have been involved for a very long time and these and previous campaigns, but actually this is kind of a great opportunity, and I really think that this is the time when we really need to redouble our efforts and push and get some of this change, not just to fight against RCEP and the next agreement, but actually let's try and change the policy. And I think that's significant. And the other thing is, let's kind of set the context with the IPCC report. It's kind of, thank you for Vijay and Claire for being here and reminding us of some of the priorities for the Pacific, and people like Yvonne who kind of work in the Pacific all the time, and many of others who have campaigned on climate change, on inequality and justice, and the time frames we have to do this stuff are getting really short, and actually it's kind of beyond the stuff that we need to put on a 10-year time horizon, say by 2030 we ought to have started to do stuff. Actually, we really are running out of time, something serious. And, I think all of us probably are convinced by the need to say, if we don't push for urgent action, then in a way we will have failed our future generations and ourselves. So that's a real plea to get involved. Thank you all very much for coming. We'll have the film coming up now. If any of you can stay for it, that would be great, because it's really good stuff. But I appreciate some people have to go.
I just want to say something about the film, especially for those who aren't here. Jim Stanford was going to come and speak yesterday morning, and he wasn't able to come, and so he has specially recorded this for this hui. So it would be great if people can watch it, but also the URL will be available later for people who want to watch it again or want to use it, especially the unions, because Jim's working from the Centre for Future Work. So I just want to encourage you really to make the best use of this resource. And for those who really want to do something immediate, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is the RCEP stakeholder consultation at the Sky City. Go to the MFAT website, RCEP, go and register, and it will be lovely to see you there, and I'm sure the negotiators and MFAT will be delighted to see you as well. And given that Penny's not there to pull out one of her masks, maybe you could be creative.